Thank you, Armando. And Armando is going to be here, so if you have any more questions, catch him at the coffee break. So we have to move on now. It's my pleasure to introduce to David Sontag. He's an associate professor at MIT here at the Institute for Medical Engineering and Sciences and the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. His research is at the intersection of AI and healthcare. So please help me welcome David.
Muchas gracias por la invitación, venir acá y buenos días. Bien, aquí tenemos un libro que se llama Temas de Inteligencia Artificial, escrito en español. ¿En qué año creen que estaba escrito? Y por favor, raise your hand cuando crees que es ese año. 2016, 2000, 1995, 1990, 1985, 1970. Bien. A ver. 1972. Temas de inteligencia artificial escrito por Sontag, tesoro. Sontag es mi papá. Entonces, mi papá era un estudiante en la Universidad de Buenos Aires en los 70s, haciendo su licenciatura. Y en esa época había muchísima gente que les interesaba muchísimo de inteligencia artificial. Tenían una computadora, pues, pero no una computadora como ese, una computadora muy grande de IBM, y estaban desarrollando toda la tecnología de que estamos hablando ahora. Y la verdad es que casi nada de lo que estamos imaginando que podemos hacer con inteligencia artificial, ninguno de eso es nuevo, ¿no? Pero ¿qué pasó? ¿No? Porque todas las cosas que estuvimos pensando que hubiera pasado, no pasó. Y estamos en un momento cuando ahora parece que quizás ahora es el momento que todos nuestros sueños van a desarrollar. Entonces, hoy en mi plática, que voy a hablar en inglés en un momento porque, bueno, yo nací aquí, voy a hablar sobre inteligencia artificial en la área de salud. Y yo estoy muy emocionado por esa área porque yo pienso que tenemos una oportunidad para mejorar el mundo con esta tecnología y que, bueno, que hay una gran oportunidad en Latinoamérica para usarlo. So I'll switch now to English to give you the rest of my talk because all of my slides are in English. Healthcare is a problem which really impacts all of us. And here in the United States, my focus is all in the United States because I was born here, I know this country well, I know the market here. The cost of healthcare is increasing over, it currently costs over $3 trillion per year and growing. That number is really hard to fathom. But despite the huge cost of healthcare, we're not actually doing a good job at it today. Because even here in the United States, where we have some of the best medical professions, people are being diagnosed late, chronic disease is being inappropriately managed, and as a result, this is leading to lots of preventable complications and heartbreak. And I know every single one of us in this room have our own personal stories about things that have gone wrong in healthcare. For myself, I have more stories than I can count on my fingers. Perhaps the most poignant of those was of my mother, who died 2 years ago from a cancer called multiple myeloma, to blood cancer. And my mom knew that she had this cancer over 3 years before she died. So it wasn't a problem of not being caught. It was caught. It was caught very early, in fact. But she never even began treatment, despite the fact that she was being seen by the world's best clinicians in this area here in Boston. So what happened? Well, there was a very simple algorithm that was being used to suggest what stage of the disease she was in. And that algorithm said she was in the very early stage, and the common wisdom is don't treat yet, wait. And so we waited, no treatment, just waiting, 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 until suddenly it was too late because the cancer had attacked her heart and led to heart failure. And of course, they immediately began treatment, but it wasn't fast enough. And this is only one of very many examples where we have the data, and this is not rocket science, and we should be able to do better. And I claim that we can do better using machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so the opportunity we have is not just that we have the data, but we have the data in digital form. And that's relevant here in the United States in particular. So whether it be imaging data or data that comes from going to a lab and getting blood test, we have that data in a way which we can then act upon. So on the right-hand side here, I'm showing the adoption of electronic medical records in the United States. This is something which, to my knowledge, is a big obstacle to translation in Latin America and Argentina, for example. Only a couple of hospitals, to my knowledge, have electronic medical records. But this plot is to show you that the story can change really quickly. So in the United States, if you go back to 2008, so just a little bit over 10 years ago, only 9% of hospitals in the US had electronic medical records. And because of federal legislation and $30 billion of incentives given from the government to industry, that number changed. And now today, we're at almost 100% of adoption of electronic medical records here in the United States. And what that means is we have the data that we can use for machine learning. And those approaches that I mentioned, right? This book wasn't called Themes in Machine Learning, it was called Themes in AI. And one of the really big things that happened to AI in the last couple of decades has been the huge progress we've made in machine learning. And of course, to do machine learning, you need data in electronic format, right? And that's where this is critical. And I'm going to end on this point as well, because if we think about the path to having AI impact Latin America, it's going to start here. Now, here in the US, the opportunity presented by this has not been lost on anyone. Particularly, it hasn't been lost on the tech giants who have been investing very heavily in AI in healthcare. So for example, Apple, if any of you have an Apple Watch, the latest edition of Apple Watch comes built in with a EKG monitor, so it can measure the electrical impulses being sent from your heart to try to understand the condition of your heart, and uses that to diagnose a condition called atrial fibrillation. That's something which is based on machine learning technology and is now deployed widely, and it's even regulated. So there is a pathway for the Food and Drug Administration in the United States to quantify the safety of algorithms such as those. Google, which is another player putting huge resources into AI in healthcare, has been looking at how can we take that imaging data that is now digitized, everything from X-rays to MRIs to pictures that you may take of a person's eye, and ask how can you use that for a number of diagnostic tasks. So for example, something they're really excited about, which is relevant, they're doing a number of deployments in India, is to diagnose what's called diabetic retinopathy. And traditionally that's done by having an ophthalmologist look at a patient's eye, and requires quite a bit of expertise, but unfortunately there's a huge shortage of such trained ophthalmologists in many parts of the world, but it's something which one can now use AI techniques to do as well as the best humans. And so that's an opportunity to try to automate some processes in healthcare. A couple of my favorite startup companies here in Boston and New York City are also looking at this. So for example, PathAI here in Boston is looking at the field of pathology, where one can take a biopsy from a patient, you take the sample, you put it on a slide, and you take a picture of it. And then you take that picture and you feed it to a machine learning algorithm to understand both does this patient have cancer, for example, or what is the patient's risk of progression? And again, this is an area where first you could think about automation, but really this is about going beyond what humans can do, because the technology is becoming so advanced that now one can add antibodies, a variety of kinds, to the sample and start to get a cell-by-cell picture of this actual gene expression within each cell, and it starts to get to the stage where no human can actually make sense of it anymore by themselves. And that's where computers can become really helpful. Butterfly Networks in New York City, one of my former students is the head of AI there, has developed a portable ultrasound device. So this is a handheld device you can connect to your phone and allows you to look at a patient's organs, particularly their heart, to diagnose a number of different heart conditions. And what I'm really excited about here is that it starts to lower the barrier to, it starts to lower the expertise needed of the person who's doing the exam through the use of AI. So in particular, on the phone, it's guiding the individual to try to acquire a good image. So it'll say, move up, move left, move down, twist your hand a little bit, in order to get exactly the right image, which can then be fed into an AI algorithm to help understand what the patient's risk is. So something like that I see as being part of a broader trajectory of how healthcare is going to change, both in the United States and globally. Healthcare is going to start to move closer and closer to patients' homes. My wife, who is Mexican, just moved to the United States 10 years ago when we got married, grew up in a part of Mexico City where on every block, in essence, you have a clinic, a very small clinic. You pay, I don't know, 50 pesos, for some very basic exams, a little bit more for more. And what I think is going to end up happening is, as the cost of devices like these start to go down, you're going to start to see these small clinics actually be able to purchase them for themselves. And then it'll both open up new business opportunities for them because they can charge a little bit more money to try to go a bit further in what they could do at that local clinic, but also it's going to completely change the way that healthcare is managed in places like these, because where the barriers to getting where the barriers to being proactive in your healthcare are too high because of the complications in getting that care. If it's as easy as just walking down the street to get something you're concerned about checked up for a cost that you can actually afford, it starts to now, I think, shift the paradigm in the way that we start to think about preventative health and managing chronic disease. And I think that's going to have a really profound impact in our health. So there are thousands of startups working on healthcare and AI here in the United States. I don't know so much about what's going on in Latin America, but I'd really love to hear from you. And just to conclude with my vision before talking about what I'm doing in the lab here at MIT, my vision is to directly augment patients. So the technologies I told you about up to here were really about how do we help doctors of a variety of kinds do their work better. But I think the future of healthcare is going to be one where, because of the pushing of health to the fringes, patients themselves are going to take on much more responsibility in their healthcare. And it's going to be aided by technology like this, maybe standing on your mobile phone, which will start from having a good understanding of your current medical status by having a good past medical record on this personal health device. And it'll use that medical history together with some of the most recent sensors that I've been describing and new ones that we're still inventing to help with, for example, diagnosing acute conditions. Maybe your 4-year-old has a rash that you're really concerned about, and you take a picture of it in your phone, and you ask your phone, should I be worried about this rash? Or maybe you're a patient with a heart disease and your legs are swollen and you want to understand what actions to take. And And this augmentation, which is provided by AI, is going to, in some cases, be able to help you, but also help guide you to where you can get the correct care and get more information. So maybe it'll say, go to that local clinic that I was just talking about and give a blood sample, or use one of those portable ultrasound, or have someone use one of those portable ultrasound devices to take a better look at your heart. But then I think the other side of it is about managing chronic disease. So I think the future of managing chronic disease is going to be one where patients themselves can start to get guidance about their treatment therapies. Here's an example of a patient who just comes home from the hospital and is taking what's called a diuretic to try to remove fluid from their body, which is caused by their heart condition. But managing the dosage of that diuretic is very hard. And here in the United States, patients are not getting the guidance they need. They're afraid to call their cardiologist because they don't want to, because they recognize their cardiologist is really busy, or because they don't want to stand on the phone for 20 minutes or for 2 hours to try to get someone on the phone to help answer it. And so as a result, they go a long time before actually getting the help that they need. But in this case, based on some simple feedback, for example, just looking at using the patient's weight changes across time connected with fluid intake, one can give a good idea of how one can try to automatically suggest changes to this medication. Or again, you could think about figuring out how you can go gather new information. So we've been seeing these major advances in AI and everything from self-driving cars to better speech recognition. And healthcare is really different, and that's something a message I want to leave you with. It's different because first, we don't have large public data sets that one can use to train machine learning algorithms, and that's a good thing from one respect because your health data is private. Right? You don't necessarily want your health data to be out in the open. It's personal. But it also makes research really hard and very different from these other fields. There's no simulator. So if we think about how do we come up with good policies for managing chronic disease, well, that's a reinforcement learning problem. But the successes we've been seeing in reinforcement learning in the past few years have been in areas where you're playing a game, like Atari or some other video game, or you're playing chess, or you're playing the game of Go. And in all of these cases, we know the rules of the game. We could play the game using a simulator. And none of that holds true in healthcare. There is no good simulator for the human body, and that mimics the health system. And more importantly, we can't experiment as we might experiment in games, because do you want to be the subject of an epsilon greedy algorithm? Epsilon greedy is an algorithm for reinforcement learning which does exploration by flipping a coin and choosing a random action. Right? So, and obviously the stakes are much higher. So we don't have the data we need. We can't train in the way that's typically done. And it's because of that there's a huge research challenge, and that's why my lab here at MIT is focused on these challenges, because I think there's a major opportunity to not just have a social impact, but to actually solve some really hard AI research challenges. So I gave you a picture right now. I hope I gave you a picture of where I want this field to go and what we're working towards. But I want to give you a little bit of a sense now about how I try to test out my ideas locally in my own hometown of Boston, Massachusetts. And here locally, we're focusing on a much shorter term problem, that of AI-powered electronic medical records. So we have electronic medical records at all of our local hospitals. We want to ask, how can we bring AI inside them to improve patient care today from the provider side? So one example we've been doing is to use algorithms to automatically structure your medical history. So your medical history might consist of laboratory test results that come from every time you went to a clinic, records of what medications you're taking. Anytime you went to a doctor, there might be clinical notes written by doctors about summarizing that visit.
And what we want to do is be able to take that data and automatically turn it into a structured history of the patient's past medical history and what really happened to them and what's going on with them now. And then one can use that, once it's in this structured form, to drive a number of downstream use cases. For example, to provide inputs to risk scores and to help automatically surface relevant past medical history. So here in Boston, there's a hospital called Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. It's one of Harvard Medical School's teaching hospitals. And for the last 8 years, my lab has been working with them to actually get AI integrated into the electronic medical record. And today, in the emergency department, we have our algorithms deployed. And they're using techniques that I just showed you in the previous slide to automatically infer these conditions, so these historical conditions and these acute conditions, from all of the messy data that's in the electronic medical record. And because they're machine learning based algorithms, they allow us to generalize much more quickly from place to place. So for example, the traditional way of trying to tackle these problems would be to write some regular expression, just, look for mentions of the word chest pain in a note, for example. But those don't generalize well because the language that's used from one place to another could be different, and there are many more signals that there are many more signals that could give insight into it. And so, for example, for cardiac etiology, our algorithm automatically picks up that if any of these medications were prescribed while the patient was in the emergency department, then the patient is likely to have a cardiac problem. Similarly, if any of these words shown here were written in a note, so chest pain, but also CP, which is an acronym for chest pain, then the patient is likely to have chest pain. If in the patient's past medical history, you have any of these medications recorded, such as Lasix, which is a diuretic, then the patient is likely to have a cardiac condition. And all of this is picked up automatically by our machine learning algorithms. And so once you have the ability to automatically structure that data, you can do a number of things with it. So for example, we could try to standardize best practices, such as when a patient walks into the hospital with complaining of chest pain, what should be the right exams to do? For example, should you be ordering, which laboratory tests should you be ordering? Which medications might you want to prescribe? What imaging to order? And should you start any initial treatment? These are standardized best practices that the community has found to improve medical care for patients who have chest pain. But without these AI techniques triggering this, it's being used in a very inconsistent way. So now that we know that the patient walked into the hospital complaining about chest pain, we can automatically surface this and make sure that the clinical best practices are actually being used for the right patients. Another example is to automatically trigger clinical decision support. So there are algorithms that have been created for how to manage patients with sepsis, which is a condition caused by infection that leads to organ failure. But right now, those algorithms are again being inconsistently used. So many patients who have sepsis are not being treated appropriately. Again, using these techniques, we can automatically pop up a box that looks like this saying enroll patient in pathway, and the moment the clinician clicks that button, suddenly now the clinician is being guided through how to care for this patient with that condition. The second example I want to give is getting back to this question of where do we get the training data for AI in healthcare? And I think because of the uniqueness of healthcare, we need to rethink also that annotation process. And perhaps the right way to get the right annotated data for healthcare is by augmenting the electronic medical records to collect that data actually as part of clinical practice. Now, clinicians hate using drop-down lists, and they hate using checkboxes because it slows them down. And in order to ever hope to collect the right data, we need to make it a hell of a lot faster for them. And so what we've been doing is using machine learning to do what's called contextual autocomplete. So here's an example of something that has been deployed and used for already 400,000 patients. It's a very simple intervention where we simply say we want to collect better data for the chief complaint. The chief complaint is the main reason the patient came to the hospital. So to get this better data, structured data, we had to change the whole workflow. Rather than the chief complaint being the first thing that the nurse enters when the patient walks in, previously as free text, we make it the last thing that they enter. They first take the patient's temperature, they get their heart rate, they measure their blood pressure, and they write up a note about what's called a triage note about, why is this patient coming to the hospital today? We take that data then and we predict what are the chief complaints that we think are the relevant ones for this patient. And we also give the option for clinicians to type it in and then to suggest completions of what they're typing in from this very, very large ontology. And the big difference is that instead of just looking at what are other words that have this spelling, we use our machine learning algorithms to say, well, contextually, based on what we already know about the patient, which of these are probably the ones that the clinician is looking for. And in doing so, then what we've shown is that the number of keystrokes it takes to enter in that structured information goes from an average of 11.6 keystrokes to under 1, to 0.6 keystrokes to find the right chief complaint. And the reason why it's less than 1 is because sometimes it's right there and all they have to do is click. Now we've also shown, again, this has been deployed and running live for already 6 years. We've also shown that the quality improves. So not only does it get faster to enter in the right information, but the quality of the data has also substantially improved over that time. So walking towards my conclusion now, what is the focus of my lab's research? I gave you a lot of background about the challenges we're trying to solve, but to get there, we need, first of all, algorithms that can learn from little annotated data, because getting any annotations is hard. And so we've been working on semi-supervised learning algorithms that can use a large amount of unlabeled data with a very small amount of labeled data or just clinician expertise to try to learn to predict a number of clinical conditions. We are redesigning the electronic medical record to collect better data, and I've talked to you about that already. And we're also working on new algorithms for doing treatment recommendations. And this is something we've not talked about much, but it starts to bring you away from the land of supervised machine learning to the land of causality and causal inference. Because one has to think about not just how do we predict future health states, but how do we change future health states. And to conclude, I think that there is an enormous opportunity to improve human health around the world, and particularly in Latin America, using artificial intelligence. To succeed, we need the following things. We need electronic medical records, and we need what's called interoperability, meaning that a patient and their clinicians need to have access to all of the health data for that patient, not just the health data from one part of the health system. We need large annotated data sets for research and development. We need safe and robust machine learning algorithms where the risk of doing something wrong here is just as high, if not higher, as the risk of an autonomous car crashing into a wall. And we need safe algorithms as a result. And we need really rich collaborations between clinicians and AI researchers. And perhaps we need to completely rethink the way that we're training clinicians and completely rethink the way that we're changing AI researchers so that they can start to work together in this new field. Now, I started out by talking to you about this book that my dad wrote 40, 50 years ago on AI and healthcare in Latin America. And I'm excited that there is so much interest from the community here in building AI and growing research and development in AI in Latin America. And outside of my duties at MIT, I'm also chief health strategist at a company in New York City called ASAP. And we've already opened up an office in Buenos Aires. We have something like 40 or 50 people there already. Some of the top data scientists, software engineers, and machine learning engineers in Argentina are working there. we have many more openings as well, and so I invite you to apply for our jobs in Argentina. I was just in our Argentina office 2 weeks ago, and it's absolutely amazing. The fun of it is sort of the same as what I see at the best tech offices here in the United States, but perhaps with even smarter people. Anyway, thanks, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'll stick around a little bit afterwards.
Thank you, David. Very interesting. I will ask Abel, please come in to connect your computer, and while he connects here, David can take some questions. So if anybody wants to go and ask something, now is your chance.
Pretty small question. So the fact that you're highlighting to the doctors what might be the problem, could that induce biases or priming the responses of the, have you seen a reduction in the variability? Is that something that you control for?
That's a great question. So you asked two different questions. The first question is about does it reduce variability? And indeed, that's the hope of using these techniques, to reduce variability, in essence, to get best practices. You make every clinician as good as the best clinicians. But the bias aspect that you asked about is perhaps the most important one. And so in the very simple example I showed of where we suggest chief complaints, that's not suggesting treatments, that's suggesting ways to document. Even there, we were really worried about biases because these chief complaints actually do end up affecting treatments down the line. And what we discovered, and only after doing a research study and very carefully evaluating, is that the quality actually improved. So we weren't biasing towards a small number of perhaps the wrong conditions. But this is the type of thing where it's really hard to prove a theorem about it, and only by actually doing deployment and doing research and publishing research so that other people can learn about it, can we actually start to discover that.
Dave, thanks. Thanks for a great talk. I'm a surgeon, and I'm fascinated with technology in healthcare, and especially AI, and especially in Latin America. I'm from Venezuela, so well, you made my trip here worth, I should say. But anyways, that algorithm that you showed and how to improve documentation and physician and nurse satisfaction, and it's also pretty interesting. And having the current complaint being last, that's also interesting. And we do hate typing, and we do hate the obtuse digital health or medical records that we've had and we are forced to use. But in your algorithm, our outcomes fed into this system, because it's nice to be quicker and easier for everyone to, and follow the best practices. But how about the outcome?
Yeah, it's a great question. That gets back to my last point on my conclusion slide, or on the research slide about causal inference. So once you want to start guiding, therapy choices, for example, or really any decision that you want to make, including suggesting chief complaints, you could try to mimic what has been done in the past, analogous to imitation learning, if you're familiar with RL, reinforcement learning. But the best you can hope to do for that is to do as well as clinicians in the past. Really, where the future of this should be going is looking at outcomes and using causal inference techniques, or what's called off-policy reinforcement learning techniques in the dynamic setting, to try to optimize for outcomes directly. And then you could hope to do better than today's clinical practice. The challenge is that our algorithms are not very good for that today. So it's a field that has had decades of research in statistics, but the moment you start to get high-dimensional data, existing techniques start to break. So that's where a lot of our research at MIT has been focused on, getting good algorithms that can work for that exact problem. Thanks.
Please thank David for a great presentation.